just been catching up on a little housekeeping here at the Poe Museum, but why don't I take a little break to tell you about some more of my favorite Poe artifacts in this week's Curator's Crypt. Welcome to the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. While the Poe Museum is renowned for its collection of Edgar Allan Poe's personal items, manuscripts, letters, and first editions, what you might not realize is that we even have a piece of it. Right back here is a lock of Edgar Allan Poe's hair, cut from his head just after his death by his friend Joseph Evans Snodgrass. And it just might solve the mystery of Poe's death. Imagine you're the Baltimore magazine editor Joseph Snodgrass. It's October of 1849, Election Day. The polls are a rowdy place known for drinking and fighting, even a practice called cooping, in which political gangs would find somebody from out of town, drug them, get them drunk, and drag them from poll to poll, voting over and over again for their candidate, changing their clothes each time so they won't be recognized. And then Snodgrass gets a letter from someone he hasn't heard from for years. One of his acquaintances sends him a note that says, "There's a gentleman, rather the worse for wear at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe and appears in great distress. And he says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you, he is in need of immediate assistance." By this time, it had been about 7 years since Snodgrass had last heard from Poe. Poe had been trying to sell him the story The Mystery of Marie Roget, which Snodgrass declined to publish. When Snodgrass arrived at the polling place, as he described, Poe's hat, or rather the hat of somebody else, for he had evidently been robbed of his clothing or cheated in exchange, was of a cheap palm leaf one, without a band and soiled. His coat of commonest alpaca, and evidently second-hand, and his pants of gray mixed cashmere, dingy and badly fitting. He wore neither vest nor neckcloth, if I remember right, while his shirt was sadly crumpled and soiled. He was so utterly stupefied with liquor that I thought it best not to seek recognition or conversation, especially as he was surrounded by a crowd of drinking men, actuated by idle curiosity rather than sympathy. You could almost hear the disgust in Snodgrass's voice. Look what alcohol has done to this great poet. This poet Poe, who's known for dressing in the finest clothes, now reduced to rags, which appear to be somebody else's. Of course, Snodgrass wanted to do something for his friend, and offered to send him home with Poe's uncle Henry Herring. Now, Poe had relatives in Baltimore, but for some reason he'd contacted this magazine editor instead. And when Herring saw Poe's condition, he said, I don't want him at my house. And that's why Snodgrass sent Poe to the hospital, where he spent the last 4 days of his life surrounded by strangers. And after Poe's death, when Herring retrieved the body, he had a viewing at his house. Snodgrass went to see the poet, whose remains, he said, were visited by some of the first individuals of the city, many of them anxious to have a lock of his hair. And Snodgrass was no different. He clipped a lock of Poe's hair to keep as a souvenir of his famous friend. Then a day later, at Poe's funeral, only 7 of his acquaintances attended. Most of them were relatives, but Snodgrass was there. Now, the year after Poe's death, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, and Snodgrass took up the abolitionist cause. He crusaded against the evils of slavery, traveling to Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago to organize resistance against this new law. He reported back to William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper that he would suffer my arm to be torn from my body and my heart to follow it before I would obey this law's insolent as well as cruel requirements. And as passionate as Snodgrass was about ridding the world of slavery, he also wanted to get rid of alcohol. So once again, he delivered fiery speeches and wrote articles about the evils of drink. And to drive the point home, he presented an example of the devastating impact of alcohol on the life of a formerly great genius, Edgar A. Poe, both by lecturing about Poe's death and by publishing his version of events in papers like the Women's Temperance paper, the New York Reformer, Life Illustrated, Spiritual Telegraph, Evening Star, Los Angeles Star, and other papers across the country. Snodgrass started spreading his message. At the same time, Poe's attending physician, the one who's actually with him at the time of his death, said that Poe had not been drinking. So he started publishing articles, delivering lectures, eventually wrote a book saying that Poe was not drunk on his deathbed. Before you know it, Snodgrass and the attending physician were delivering competing lectures, each embellishing their accounts of Poe's final days. Snodgrass's aim, in his own words, was to make Poe's lifestyle seem abhorrent to others, to be an example to prevent this injury to the morals occurring to anyone else. Moran, on the other hand, portrayed Poe as an angel on his deathbed reciting poetry, eventually changed Poe's last words as cause of death as he embellished again and again his accounts. So who was telling the truth? Most scholars think both of them embellished their accounts so much that neither one is entirely reliable, considering that Snodgrass was such a staunch teetotaler. Why would have Poe asked him to come to his aid if Poe had been drinking? And in fact, 8 years before his death, Poe wrote to Snodgrass defending himself against claims that he was a drunk. In his letter, Poe insists that at no period of my life was I ever what men would call intemperate. I never was in the habit of intoxication, I never drunk drams, etc., but for a brief period while I resided in Richmond, and added to the messenger, I certainly did give way at long intervals to the temptation held out on all sides by the spirit of Southern conviviality. My sensitive temperament could not stand an excitement which was an everyday matter to my companions. In short, it sometimes happened that I was completely intoxicated. For some days after each excess, I was invariably confined to bed, but it is now quite 4 years since I have abandoned every kind of alcoholic drink. 4 years, with the exception of a single deviation, which occurred shortly after my leaving Burden, which is a magazine where we'd been working, and when I was induced to resort to the occasional use of cider, with the hopes of relieving a nervous attack. I have now only to repeat to you in general my solemn assurance that my habits are as far removed from intemperance as the day from the night. My sole drink is water. And Poe trusts that Snodgrass will believe him and take him at his word, because you are a physician, and I presume no physician can have difficulty in detecting the drunkard at a glance. So Poe puts his faith that Snodgrass will help defend him from these claims that Poe's been drinking too much. Now, in his lifetime, Poe was ridiculed for his drinking. And according to some who knew him, he could only handle about a glass of wine before he was staggering drunk. He would be sick for days afterwards. But that didn't stop Poe's enemies from attacking him in print. In fact, one of them, Thomas Dunn English, wrote a novel, The Doom of the Drinker, featuring a caricature of Poe as a character. And also in his novel, 1844, The Secret of the SF, English portrays Poe as Marmaduke Hammerhead, the drunken author of a poem called The Black Crow. So even during Poe's lifetime, there was controversy about how much Poe drank, when he drank, and what impact it had on his life. Now, Snodgrass continued to tour and give lectures, and eventually saw the abolition of slavery. It was only after his death that alcohol was briefly banned in the United States. Now, sometime before his death in 1880, Snodgrass gave his little lock of Poe's hair to the Baltimore publisher G.W. Majors. And then from Majors, the strands went to the New York rare book dealer George D. Smith, known as the Czar of the American rare book trade. The Poe Museum's first president and head of the acquisitions committee, James Howard Whitty, purchased the lock in February 1921. An act he must have thought seemed like a good idea. In those days, before the advent of modern archival practices, Whitty glued the strands of hair, which were glued to an envelope, to another piece of paper, and then made a little collage where he glued a clipping from the auction catalog to the same piece of paper. And this strange contraption with hair and collage was a highlight of the museum's first exhibit when it opened in 1922. It's been on display on and off ever since. In 2002, the Discovery Health Channel approached the museum about performing a test on the lock of hair to determine Poe's cause of death. What information did this hair contain? Unfortunately, they said they'd have to destroy all the hairs in order to perform the test. And that was just not an option. We can't destroy the artifact to find out the cause of Poe's death. Now, eventually, they were able to acquire some strands of hair from another collection, and they found they needed significantly fewer hairs in order to conduct these tests. So what exactly were these tests? Albert Donnet, an environmental health engineer in Baltimore, designed a study to see if Poe's hair contained any evidence that his death and certain bizarre passages in his writing resulted from the long-term effects of carbon monoxide exposure from illuminating gas. So the test was conducted. They searched for heavy metals and anything else that might give some kind of clue to his health. And one thing they did was they tested one end of the hair, then the other, factoring that the hair grows about 1/4 of an inch every 2 weeks. They could determine what Poe's levels were about 6 months apart. One thing they found out was that Poe's mercury levels were high, but not enough to cause mercury poisoning. They actually found that his mercury levels shot up about 264% in the last few months of his life. This was from medicine he was taking. A doctor in Philadelphia prescribed calomel, which is made of mercury. And back then, these mercury pills were a cure-all. They cure your tuberculosis, your cholera. Sure, they might kill you eventually. And even Poe understood that these were detrimental to his health. But doctor's orders. They also saw that Poe's lead levels were fairly significant in the first part of the hair. But then over time, his lead levels dropped. And some scholars think this is a result of Poe giving up drinking. in the months before his death. In fact, Poe himself had become a temperance advocate. He joined the Sons of Temperance in Richmond, probably as a way to win the approval of his fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton. And he'd given up alcohol. And he had people in this temperance group follow him around Richmond to make sure he stayed away from the Demon Run. Now, is this conclusive evidence? We can't be sure. And we can't be sure what happened to Poe in the last week of his life. Did he go on a drinking binge? Was he drunk when Snodgrass found him? Did he die from the effects of this debauch? That's not in the hair. Unfortunately, the hair was clipped. So we've lost the last little piece of Poe's hair that would have been underneath the skin, which takes about a week to come to the surface. But this wasn't the end of the testing of Poe's hair. In fact, the University of Virginia professor, Steve the Hair Doctor Macco, performed his own stable isotope analysis of Poe's hair. He tried to find what the different isotopes of carbon and nitrogen told us about Poe's diet. Once again, he didn't find evidence of the long-term effects of carbon monoxide exposure in Poe's hair, but he did find that Poe had a pretty balanced diet. He had poultry, pork, a lot of seafood. But it looks like malnutrition wasn't the cause of Poe's death. Those are the tests that have been conducted so far in Poe's hair. I do not know of any tests that are about to be conducted or any attempt to clone the poet, but there are other locks of hair out there to be tested. In addition to the several locks cut from his head at the time of his death, there are also locks of hair that Poe gave to his female admirers. And these could potentially give us information about different periods of Poe's life, not just the end. But looking at the evidence we have so far, how do you think Poe died? Well, we probably won't be testing any of our sample of Poe's hair. You definitely can come to the museum and see it in person. It's the closest thing you get to seeing Edgar Allan Poe in the flesh. So I'm Chris Simpner, the curator of the Poe Museum, and this has been the Curator's Crypt. Well, there seems to have been a most unfortunate turn of events. But if by chance I should find my way out of this predicament, I look forward to seeing you on next week's installment of the Curator's Crypt.